I'm going to start with a reading as well. This is from Mary Oliver. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's a wonderful poet. She died this week at the age of 83. Today I'm flying low and I'm not saying a word. I'm letting all the voodoos of ambition sleep. The world goes on as it must, the bees in the garden rumbling a little, the fish leaping, the gnats getting eaten, and so forth. But I'm taking the day off. Quiet as a feather, I hardly move, though really I'm traveling a terrific distance. Stillness, one of the doors into the temple. Stillness, one of the doors into the temple. The first time I read that, Mary Oliver gave me a gift that is permanent, even when she's not here anymore. It resonated very, very strongly with me. As Reverend Gay mentioned earlier, I'm a therapist and a psychologist at Augusta University. And frequently what I try to create in that 50-minute hour is a space where there is complete presence in that moment, where a person can be still, where attention is fully in the room. What happened on Facebook an hour ago doesn't matter, and anxieties about the future fall away. Sometimes it means finding a way to let go of what another person has said, or not said, or done, or not done. For me, it means creating a sanctuary where the chatter falls away, and the static quiets, and those things occupy so much space in our heads that when they are there, we don't have time for stillness. So I work towards stillness. And I'm not talking about my clients. I'm talking about me. That's what I work toward. The moments in counseling when I have felt that the most helpful things happened or the most connecting things happened have been in those times when there was no plan, when I had no awareness of why I was saying what I was saying, but it was the thing that came out of my mouth. It's when my awareness wasn't 5 days in the future or 5 hours in the future or 5 minutes in the future. It's when it was fully present. And that full presence, I have found, has allowed for things to happen that are wonderful. And I mean wonderful to happen in that environment. The same is true for me in my life in general, and that is a challenge for me. Finding a way to live in the present as opposed to the anxious future has been a lifelong journey for me. Anxiety is in my DNA. On my father's side, I come from a long line of family worriers. It's kind of what we do. The joke in our family is that when a new baby is born, it doesn't cry, it wrings its hands. It's true. I was one of those children. And when I was a child, my mother had cross-stitched this thing, and she put it on the wall in our den, and it read, "Today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday, ... and all is well." And at the time, I was just sure she had made it specifically for my father. Now I know she was the only person in the family that didn't need it. So it resonated with me. Yeah, I've got a long relationship with anxiety, with the anxious future, and with its close sibling control. Those two things often walk very closely hand in hand. I could have written the quote from, one of my favorite quotes actually, from a French writer, Montaigne, who said, "My life has been filled with terrible misfortune, most of which never happened." I hand that out to clients on a regular basis. And that was my normal until about 20 years ago. And 20 years ago is when I really put my hands in clay in a serious way for the first time. My journey to developing a relationship with clay was long. Getting there was long, but it has provided me with some lessons about how I approach life that have been very helpful to me and to my loved ones, Ted. I'm sure for you as well. So here's a little bit about how I came to find working in clay and a few lessons about what has been meaningful for me. Some of those lessons will feel obvious and simple and straightforward. Some of them might sound more meaningful, but all of them have carried great weight for me. And I hope that some of it resonates with you as well. Lesson number one for me was that taking a risk is better than devotion to the illusion of security. 20 years ago, I was living in North Carolina. I was in a job that was a worthwhile job. It was working with the Centers for Disease Control around HIV prevention efforts in the country, and it was, on paper, should have been incredibly fulfilling, and it wasn't. I wasn't bringing my full self to it. I knew something was off a little bit for me. And occasionally little alarms would go off and say, move, do something. Something different needs to happen in your life to be really full. But I'm sort of risk averse in life in general, and so it takes more than little alarms to get me to make a move. But there were three things that were key for me in making that happen. One is that I was able to spend some time in France one summer. And one of the things that, well, first of all, I don't speak the language. And it's very liberating to go to a place where you don't speak the language. People leave you alone. And you can actually observe some things and incorporate some things, and if you're reflective, take home some lessons. And one of the lessons for me was that life did not have to be about working. It didn't have to be that way. And that's where my life had ended up. It felt like work. Every challenge was just a frustration. So I came back home, had that lesson in my head. The next thing that happened was that shortly after that, Princess Diana was killed in a moto accident. Her car, being driven by her bodyguard, crashed in the tunnel, and she died. And of course, the whole world experienced that. But for some reason, when that happened, this light bulb went off for me that life is short, and there is no security about tomorrow. And if I was going to do something, I better do it soon. Don't put it off. It just resonated in a different way, but I still didn't listen. And then one day, I came home from work, and there in my mailbox was a flyer for a conference, and all I could see across the top was the courage to change. And I said, Uncle, I give up. The change is coming. I quit my job the next week, and I moved to Georgia. And I didn't know what my next step was. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew what my next step wasn't, and it wasn't staying where I was. So I moved to Georgia, and I knew that I needed to lie fallow for a while. How many of you know you don't have to raise your hand, but do some of you know what it means to lie fallow? People who didn't grow up in farming communities or in a rural area may not know that. But basically, when a field has been planted over and over and over again, the crops will sort of depleted of its nutrients. And so what farmers historically did more often, and some still do, is to let the field lie fallow, to let the nutrients replenish themselves, to let the soil be rich again before it's ready to produce the next crop or something else. And I knew that I needed in my life to lie fallow for a while. So that was one lesson. I needed to lie fallow. The second lesson relates to that, and that is my realization that lying fallow may look like nothing is happening, but it's not stagnation and it's not passive. A lot's happening under the surface. What I realized when I moved from North Carolina down to Georgia was that I had to engage in some sort of activity that would regenerate that for me. And for me, I sort of reflected back on things I'd loved doing as a child and play and all of those things. And it was always some sort of artistic endeavor. I grew up in North Carolina near a lot of pottery and a lot of potters, so I'd always been fascinated with that. So I decided to take some pottery classes and explore that, see what would happen if I did that. And in doing that, I found out that what Thomas Merton had said was absolutely right when he said, Art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. I found that I pay close attention to experiences where time seems to dissolve, and I forget myself, and I hear little voices that help me find myself, sort of bubbling up through that time. But it involved putting myself in that position and engaging in an activity that would let that happen for me. When I put my hands in clay, when I started working with it, I would start and I would look up and I would think it had been 10 minutes and it had been 3 hours. That was the experience. And those were 3 blissful hours. Which brings me to life lesson number 3 that I got from the experience. I have found that the decision to intentionally engage in some sort of artistic activity that gently and powerfully guides me to be completely engaged in the present moment. Clay will make you do that. Be completely engaged in the present moment. That when that happens, there is no room for worry. It takes up the space. There's no room for worry. Today stops being the tomorrow that you worried about yesterday. Each day is that day. And each day is a better day. And so the tomorrow actually ends up being a better day when it shows up as well. And each hour stops being the hour that you worried about. It starts being this hour. It's not just about being present in the day or being present in the hour. It's about being present in the moment. It sounds simple. In some ways it is. The concept is very simple. But getting there, for me, and for a lot of people, I think, takes discipline. It takes practice. And for me, it takes a practice. It takes some endeavor that I'm involved in. It also means, for me, setting up my environment in the right way. Technology is a wonderful thing in lots of ways, but one of the things I have found is that technology makes becoming still much, much more difficult. Anything that pulls my attention away from the present moment makes it far harder to approach that door into the temple. So, I make some decisions. I don't have my cell phone with me all the time. I don't have it in the same room with me. I leave it at home sometimes when I go out and do things. I don't have it in hearing distance. I don't hear the ding go off that suggests there's a text that if I don't respond to in the next 5 minutes, somebody's going to think a piece of furniture has fallen on me and I can't get up. People start to worry when you don't respond in 5 seconds. They have come to learn not to expect me to respond in 5 seconds. And I know that I need that in order to keep myself as fully present in the moment on a regular basis. Life lesson number 4, and this has been spoken about a couple of times this morning already. Trying to control or holding on to outcomes is highly overrated. In working with clay, I gained a much deeper understanding of what T.S. Eliot meant. It's one of my favorite quotes in the world, when he said, "For us, there is only the trying, the rest is not our business." And I'll talk about one experience in particular that reminded me of that in a very poignant way, and it related to pottery. Not long after I started taking some of those classes, some events happened in my life in Georgia that left me in a very emotionally painful place. I was raw. And I will spare you the details, but I will tell you that I think it's fair to say that I was going through trial by fire inside while looking really cool on the outside. Nobody could see it, but I was walking through it. Very painful. And during that time, I also decided to take my first stab at doing something sculptural instead of something on the wheel. And without seeing the obvious connection, I created a sculptural piece of a bust of a man who was straining his head to lift it up. So I made the piece, had the instructor put it in the kiln. A few days later, the instructor, Melanie, was taking the pieces out of the kiln, and when she picked up that piece, she started crying. And I've got to admit, my first thought was, surely it's not that bad. But actually, what had happened was the heat of the kiln had caused the clay on the left-hand side of the man's chest to cleave off, to break away. And it left a rough scar over his heart. That piece is in the front here. The point is, the piece survived. It wasn't what I'd planned. It was better than what I had planned. And it told a more authentic story because of that. A writer who writes about pottery called A.S. Byatt said it really well, the experience of working with clay and the issue of control is, he said, quote, "You need to know how to play with what chance will do to your lovingly constructed surfaces in the heat of the kiln." You need to know how to play with what chance will do to your lovingly constructed surfaces in the heat of the kiln. And that applies to so much more than clay. And then finally, one more big life lesson for me was that finding stillness, finding a practice or a way to be still in the present and the mental quietness that goes along with that can create spaces for glimpses of what I think Joseph Campbell is talking about when he discusses the concept of eternity. I don't know, a lot of you are probably familiar with Joseph Campbell. He was a very famous mythologist and professor of myth. He did a series back in the 80s with Bill Moyers on public television called The Power of Myth. Look it up if you've never seen it. It's on, I think it's on Netflix even. It's on DVD. It's 8 sessions, and it is engaging and fascinating and powerful. And in conversation with him in that series, Joseph Campbell said, "Eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. It is that dimension of here and now which thinking and time cuts out. This is it. If you don't get it here, you won't get it anywhere. The experience of eternity right here and now is the function of life." Walt Whitman put it a little differently. Happiness, not in another place, but this place. Not for another hour, but this hour. When Tracy, my dear friend and colleague, and I were talking about this morning, we talked about how easily children play, how it comes to them, and how it's so easy for them to be not in another place but this place, and not for another hour but for this hour. And adults do tend, I think, to become so encumbered with other things that we forget how to play. And we forget that play is a very spiritual practice and experience. For me, making things in clay brought that experience of play back to me. It reminded me of the value of that and the spiritual quality of that. In full disclosure, I'm not doing a lot with clay right now. Although that might change having worked on this talk this morning. What I do now is I find that experience when I play my guitar all alone in my living room. That's when that happens for me. And I try to find it in the connection that I try to foster with all people, and certainly in the counseling work that I do. So now I'm doing a job that I know has value and meaning, and I'm fully present in it. So that path found a nice conclusion. I don't expect to go through every day with intense clarity and deep peace and moments of sublime wonder. That just doesn't happen. But what I do know now from my experience is that finding a way to be in this place for this hour increases the odds that I'm going to be still enough to remember that peace, clarity, and wonder aren't the half of the equation that drifts away. It's me. And I can try to move back in that direction. I want to close with some words from another poem that Mary Oliver left us. When I read this, they reminded me that making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be as simple as it is important. And this is from her poem called The Summer Day. Some of you may know it as The Grasshopper. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Thank you for paying attention.